Welcome to Ira's Everything Bagel, where I talk with intriguing people about everything, their passions, pursuits, and points of view. And today on Ira's Everything Bagel, I'm joined by a man who has spent a lifetime illuminating the stories behind the stories of Hollywood, Joseph McBride. Joseph is a renowned film historian, biographer, and screenwriter whose acclaimed works on giants like John Ford, Frank Capra, and Steven Spielberg have made him one of the most respected chroniclers of American cinema. His career has taken him from the newsroom, writing and reviewing for Daily Variety, to the world of screenwriting, including co-writing of the cult classic Rock and Roll High School. He's also professor emeritus in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University, where he's influenced generations of filmmakers and scholars. Now Joseph turns the camera on himself with his new memoir, I Loved Movies But. It's a series of candid and revealing conversations with Danny Peary that traces his remarkable journey through the world of movies, media, and cultural history. I Loved Movies But Conversations with Danny Peary is available on Amazon, Barnes& Noble, bookshop.org, and most importantly, stickingplacebooks.com, where you can get a discount, stickingplacebooks.com. And Joe, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you again, Ira. It's always fun. Thank you
It
for having me.
is. And this is the
Yeah.
first time the book is about you. So
Yeah,
tell us how
right.
this book came to be.
Well, Paul Cronin, who's started this innovative company, Sticking Place Books, and he's an author himself, and I've known him over the years, and he's doing all kinds of interesting, unusual books with a wide range of film critics and filmmakers from around the world, and he started a series of interview books with film critics and historians. Started with Michel Simont, the late great critic and editor for Positif, and he's got other people like Jonathan Rosenbaum and James Naramore and Gerald Perry, various fascinating people. So he asked me about a year ago to do an interview book about my career, and he suggested that rather than just kind of write it myself or interview myself, get somebody to do it for me or with me. So I thought of my old friend Danny Peary, who I went to college with at the University of Wisconsin in the 60s. And we were members of what was called the Madison Film Mafia. It was quite a vibrant community of film scholars. And 25 of us became either filmmakers or film critics, historians, professors, whatever, and some doing both, you know. And the most famous filmmaker that came out of that group was the great documentarian Errol Morris. And a lot of good scholars came out of it. And so Danny and I have known each other for a long time, and he had interviewed me a couple times on books in the last few years, my critical study of Ernst Lubitsch and my book, Two Cheers for Hollywood, which is a collection of my short pieces. So we were very comfortable doing the interviews. So I said, hey, Danny, you want to do it? And he's one reason I asked him, he's very reliable, because he's a very prolific author, and he's been writing books on films and baseball, which was my first passion as a writer. My first book was on baseball slang. When I was in high school, I wrote a book on baseball slang called High and Inside, The Complete Guide to the Language of Baseball. And Danny has written film books such as cult movies, three volumes that are really enjoyable, and people love them. And Alternate Oscars, another witty book that he wrote. He's a very good writer. And he also has written books on such baseball greats as Gil Hodges and Roger Maris and Ralph Kiner. And he did a wonderful interview volume called We Played the Game, in which he went around and interviewed all kinds of players from the 40s and 50s of the period when he and I were growing up. And I envy him for actually meeting these people who I only watched on the field. So we're a good match, and it was a pleasure, such a pleasure doing it with him. We did it by email because he lives in New York, and I brought him out of retirement. He thought he wasn't going to do another book, but he found it irresistible, and so we had great pleasure doing this book.
When you look back at your career, and as I mentioned in the intro, and you've been a guest on my show, I think at least three times, if memory serves, for various books that you've written.
Mm.
The now that this book is about you, you still are talking about Danny rather than yourself. So I'm going to spotlight back on you. What was the most interesting thing he brought out from you about your career in such a varied, I'd say show business, not just film, but just show business in general.
Well, that's kind of complicated. I've had four careers. I think that makes me unusual in the film study world. I've been a journalist since 1960, professional journalist. I've been a author of books, mostly on film, but some other subjects like the John F. Kennedy assassination. Um, and I've been a screenwriter and TV writer, and I've been a film teacher. I retired recently after 22 years teaching at San Francisco State. So all these careers kind of overlap in interesting ways and cross-fertilize each other. It was, when you do an autobiography, although this is not delving into all the personal aspects of my life, I deal with some of those, as they affect my work. It's about my work. And I tried to keep it sort of to tell people the inside backstory of the books I've written and my encounters with filmmakers, and but also, tracing my evolution as a writer, how, and I have a whole section on my formative years as a kid, with a lot of trauma and chaos in my upbringing, but very fertile cultural education and how that influenced me. Graham Greene, I quote him, my favorite modern author, is saying that a writer's life is basically determined by the first 20 years of his life, and the rest is writing about it and kind of looking back on it. And he said that's kind of true of everybody, really, when you get into it. And in the biographies I've done of Capra, Ford, and Spielberg, I spent a lot of time on their formative years, which are skipped over in a lot of film biographies. People sort of whiz through the early years because they want to get to the person making films. And Danny said that about Roger Maris. He said, his editor said, "Can't you hurry up and get to him being a baseball player?" And Danny said, "No, I want to find out what made this guy tick. He's an interesting, complex man." And so with Capra, my first big biography, I spent a lot of time examining his difficult upbringing and struggle to succeed. And that was extremely important in understanding the kind of man he became. So I found it to answer your question, I found it sort of a bittersweet emotional experience to kind of look back over my life because I had to revisit not only the happy times, but also the difficult times. Probably the worst two periods of my life were my childhood and the time I spent as a screenwriter, as a professional screenwriter for 10 years. And I had a fair amount of success as things go. Had a couple movies produced, including one that became a cult classic, Rock and Roll High School. There's even a book about the making of that film now. Stephen Armstrong did a terrific book on it. And I did 9 um, documentaries or TV specials, including 5 AFI Life Achievement Award shows with George Stevens Jr. And those were great experiences. Those were my happiest experiences as a screenwriter. But I had, a lot of projects that I wrote, 12 other scripts that didn't get filmed, and some were optioned and didn't get made. But a lot of projects that I pitched that didn't succeed. I mean, but that's kind of par for the course for professional screenwriter, and you
Sure.
have to kind of accept that if you're going to continue. But I didn't like that because when I write a book, it gets published, and I've written 25 other books, and I started writing books in 1963, in high school with my baseball book, and took 17 years to get that published, but it got published, and then I did an update later on. So that was kind of painful to revisit that, but it was very kind of enlightening to me because I could see in perspective some things that made more sense in retrospect. I mean, just to give one example, in the year 2000, the New York Times Magazine did a long article on Asperger's syndrome, which I had never heard of at the time. And now it's become very widely known to the point that it's no longer referred to much. It's on the spectrum of autism, in the DSM volumes, et cetera. But it is a helpful term. And suddenly I realized, well, gee, I fit all the symptoms. I may be high on the spectrum, but I had a lot of problems as a kid because of I, people thought I was very different and a little strange, and all these things are common to people who have Asperger's tendencies. I've never had myself examined. Spielberg, people thought for a long time maybe he was an Asperger's guy. And he actually had himself examined and he found out he was not on the spectrum, but he's dyslexic is what he found out, which explains I didn't quite understand that because when I wrote about his schooling, he was a poor student. He had trouble reading, and that's why. But Asperger's is actually kind of an asset if you're a book writer. If you're on the autism spectrum too much, it can be a real problem. There are people who are severely disabled, but some people function rather well. And a lot of artistic figures are Asperger's-ish. I say Hitchcock is a classic example. I mean, his favorite hobby was memorizing the train schedules in England, which is very, very Asperger's-ish.
I
Dan
want to go. I want to go back though to something you said, which was you mentioned all of your different careers. You didn't mention acting.
Oh, yes. Well, I had this great experience, and the background here, you see me. This is a frame enlargement. I put this on the cover of the book from the film The Other Side of the Wind that Orson Welles directed that I'm in. And you see I'm writing on my wrist. I'm moving around so you can see that. This was a habit I developed as a reviewer. And when I went to Hollywood for the first time in 1970 to interview John Ford for a book I did on him with Michael Willington, and on that amazing trip, I met Jean Renoir and I met Orson Welles and I met Peter Bogdanovich. So my three favorite directors, and then the young director critic who I modeled my life on to some extent. And he thought it was very funny. He said, "Why are you writing on your wrist?" I said, "Oh, I went to see Fellini's Satyricon today and I was writing on my wrist." And he told Orson about this, and Wells thought this was hilarious. Here's a film critic who writes on his wrist. He said, "I gotta have that guy in my movie." And Peter was recruiting film buff types for this film that was starting to shoot on the Sunday of that first week in Hollywood. And he put me in the film. I had never acted before, unless you consider being an altar boy in Catholic school. I was an altar boy for 3 years, which is a form of acting. It's a form of theater, but it's very Brissonian because you have your back to the audience and you speak in a monotone and you're speaking Latin and you can't change the words and you can't change the actions. It's all very it's like a Robert Bresson character. But um, so I was putty in Wells's hands. He enjoyed, but he let me write the dialogue with him for my scenes because I play a young film critic, historian who's very earnest. It's kind of a somewhat of a caricature myself.
But you don't you realize that even just that one little snippet of your life for some people would be the one thing in their life they would remember their whole life and talk
Yeah.
about, no matter if they did anything else.
Yeah. And I spent 5 years being in this film because it took 5 years to
Right.
shoot.
But just the
So,
idea of working with Orson Welles, co-writing,
mhm.
being cast based on the fact that he heard about you writing on your wrist. I mean, to me, that'd be enough for a whole book in itself. But clearly, there's so many things in this book, and we only have limited time. But if someone were to say to you, Joe, yeah, you regretted some of the things you did, and it was uncomfortable looking back, but you were still you're looking at it from a mature age, and you can synthesize most of that. But
Mhm.
if they narrowed you down to the three top things that were important to you in your professional life, not your personal life,
Mhm.
professional life, what would those three things be
Well,
that are in the book and that are covered in the book?
Jonathan Lethem, who's a friend of mine who's a well-known novelist, I asked him to write the foreword, and he wrote a wonderful foreword. And he said, "I have a rage for truth." And that's really true. He said, "I'm always interested in Joe's writing because he's digging behind the conventional wisdom and the official stories of things to try to find out what really happened." And so I've done that my whole life, and I trace that impulse. I mean, it does have to do with my personal life in the sense that when I was a kid, I was raised as a Catholic, and I was very oppressed by that, and I broke free of that eventually with great struggle. And also, my parents were alcoholics, and so we lived in this kind of cloud of secrecy. And I feel I was misled by school and church and country. And when Kennedy was killed, I worked for him as a volunteer in 1960 in his primary campaign in Wisconsin. I got to talk to him a couple times. I wanted to be a politician, and then I changed my view because I found that the government didn't want to solve the crime, and I was disillusioned with our political system, and it made me into a writer. So my whole life was spent digging behind the official stories, and so with, say, my Capra biography, which I think is probably my best achievement, I reinvented the wheel of Frank Capra scholarship because people just didn't know the truth about this man. He and the media had collaborated over the years in creating this appealing myth of him that bore a very tangential relationship to who the man really was. And I spent 7 years working on the book. 4 of the years were spent in a legal battle to get the book published because I ran into fierce opposition from my own publisher at Alfred A. Knopf. The famous editor Robert Gottlieb turned against the book and wanted to stifle it or kill it or neuter it, along with Capra's archivist Janine Basinger. So I had a battle with them for 4 years, and I won, but I had to go to a different publisher, Simon and Schuster. But I succeeded in getting the truth out about Capra. And another, well, those AFI shows were wonderful experiences. I got to work with legendary actors and other people, directors and collaborators who youngish screenwriters never got to work with. And I got to write speeches for them, or usually with them. And my Fred Astaire tribute that George Stevens and I put on, I think was something I'm extremely proud of. And in recent years, I've been doing critical studies again because writing biographies, which I did for quite a while, I couldn't afford to do that anymore. They're terribly expensive, and I got financially ruined every time I did one. And they don't sell enough. Film biographies, especially biographies of directors, don't interest enough people to make it financially viable. So I went into teaching so I could have a job and a healthcare and things that people really need. But I went back to writing critical studies of directors, as that's the way I started with Wells and Ford. So since then I've done critical studies of Lubitsch and Billy Wilder and the Coen brothers, and most recently George Cukor. So I've had quite a varied career, but it was fun revisiting all this stuff. And I could see I was a little more forgiving of my failures as a, I wrote that when I was writing the part about being a screenwriter, I said, this is really a chronicle of stupidity. I made so many stupid mistakes. But then I remembered my wife said to me, well, the reason you had trouble in Hollywood is you're honest. And I've always been straight shooting kind of guy. And she said, it's such a corrupt, lying environment. You were wrong it was wrong casting. But then I thought of the line in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is my favorite Capra film, in which Claude Rains, who's the corrupt senior senator, says of Jimmy Stewart's idealistic young character, he said, this boy's honest, not stupid. So I think, okay, I was honest, but I was kind of stupid too. But it's a cautionary tale, as they call it, and very interesting stories. I tried to be very entertaining, and I thought back, it just
So I want
didn't.
to get back to, because you didn't answer my question in total, and I always
Uh,
remember my question. The top three things you want people to take away from reading this book. One was your Frank Capra
mhm,
book, which makes sense based on what you were talking about. Were there
mhm.
two others that were equally important to you, or is everything important to you? In other words, or were there top three highlights of your professional life?
Well, yeah, my Kennedy books, I've done two. I actually feel that my study of the Kennedy assassination is my main interest in life, my real vocation. I feel very sense of loyalty to him, having worked for him and gotten to know him. And I was very tickled and honored in 1960 when the first time I met him was at a very small rally, and he asked a question about profiles in courage, and I answered it, and he said, I hope I don't have to run against you in 1964. which is the nicest thing anybody's ever said about me.
Absolutely.
So I
Speaking
spent
of,
all these years trying to, unravel what happened to him and also what
do you
happened.
get, well, do you get optimistic about it seems like every 10 years, another trove of material comes out, once through congressional committee, once through intelligence agencies releasing stuff, etc. So are you relatively satisfied we're getting closer to what actually happened?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we've known some of the basic things of what really happened from a very early time. The very first day, I didn't believe the official story because I, I wrote a short story about Kennedy's assassination 2 years before it happened. It's called The Plot Against a Country for my high school English class, freshman class. And I was worried about his security because I'd seen him up close and he didn't have much security. And so I was a student of the Lincoln assassination when I was a kid, and I knew that a plot probably would be involved. So when he was killed, I was not entirely surprised, but it was a tremendous blow, of course, to all of us. And um, but the very first day, I mean, I ran to a radio when I heard the news. I always want to find out, the breaking news. And they were saying the shots came from the front, either from the railroad bridge or the hill. These were network radio reports, and this was 12:40 p.m., 10 minutes after it happened. So within 20 minutes, though, by 1 o'clock, they started saying all the shots came from behind, from this building called the Texas School Book Depository. And I was a journalist by that time, and I knew that if they change a story without explaining it, a red flag goes up on my pole. If they had some valid explanation, okay, but they didn't bother explaining the change of direction. This is a radical change. And so then I began watching the TV news, and I felt this man Oswald was being railroaded. And by the end of the day, I didn't believe the official story. And
Do you feel that now, all these years later, that as more and more information comes out, it's getting closer to the way you figured it?
well, we're learning more and more. I mean, after Oliver Stone's film JFK came out in '91, he pointed out that a lot of the documents were still secret. And so literally millions of pages of US government documents have come out since then. And people are still wading through them. And Trump recently released a lot of the documents that have still been hiding. And there's still things that they haven't come out with. There was a CIA official who just about a week ago said there was a secret CIA report on the assassination that he had seen. That hasn't come out. I mean, that would be very interesting to see.
So we're,
But
we're looking at Frank Capra as one, Kennedy is two. What would be the third thing that the most meaningful in terms of your professional career? See, I'm going to keep you on track, Joe. No matter.
yeah, yeah, we have a limited time. Well, I guess I love doing critical studies of directors because, you really engage with their work really deeply. And biographies are fascinating too, especially because you get to, meet all kinds of great people and do a lot of research, which I love. But I love a deep dive into the art of somebody like George Cukor. I was just talking at a film festival the other day. I ran into an archivist and fellow author, and he thought my Cukor book takes film scholarship in a new dimension because he said you really deeply and in great detail examine how a director works with his collaborators, which isn't done enough, specifically actors. I wrote it through portraits of key performances, about 60 odd performances in his great body of work. He's a great actor's director like Wells was, and a few other people, Bergman and Ophuls. But so I had a wonderful time. That's an experiment in criticism. I'm always trying something that I haven't done before. It was an experiment to see if I could write very engagingly and where people could really enjoy reading about it and learn from it, how performances work on the screen. And acting is what most people go to see. Orson Welles thought actors were the most important people in films because they're the front line, as Capra put it, and that's what people go to see, and they don't know or care that much about the director behind the scenes. But not much is written about actors. And when I came to San Francisco State, for example, I found the student films were rather well photographed and the sound was good, but the acting and the writing were terrible. And so I tried to, I said, we should have a course on acting in cinema, how to direct actors. And they sneered at me and put me down. And we don't want to do that. It seemed like they thought that was kind of vulgar or something. But finally, a guy who was a director of films and theater said, let's do a course. And they said, okay, we'll do it. And begrudgingly, you know. But
Well, let me ask you
still,
this. We only
yeah.
have a couple of minutes left, and this will be my last question. Did Danny get something out of you that you didn't think that you were going to talk about in the book?
You know, I mean, I'm trying to rack my brain while you're asking this very good question. Did I surprise myself, I guess, with any comment that I made? I'm not sure there's anything that was like a startling shock or surprise. My Capra book, the New York Times reviewer said there's a surprise on every page because it was a story that hadn't been told. I guess I'm familiar enough with my own life that I examine myself pretty thoroughly. I think I'm pretty good at that. Although all of us have some blind spots about ourselves. But I did another memoir called The Broken Places, which was about when I had a breakdown in high school, which was actually the best thing that ever happened to me because it kind of freed me from my childhood problems. So I've been examining my life, you know, as I think as a film critic, historian gets older, your writing gets more autobiographical. And so I've been on this path. And I was just reading a quote from somebody who said that the highest form of criticism is, oh, Oscar Wilde said the highest form of criticism is autobiography. Criticism is autobiography. And so when I'm writing about Billy Wilder or Lubitsch or Wells or Ford, Ford is my favorite director, it's kind of autobiographical. You can see what I feel about life. And I've tried over the years to focus on filmmakers who have a wide range of material. You know, they deal with historical subjects and all kinds of social issues and things. And because I have a wide range of interests myself, you know, that comes from being a journalist and being concerned about American history, et cetera. This is, you know, my specialty. So I love examining how directors like Ford engage with the history of our country in revisionist ways, telling the truth, like film Fort Apache, which is pro-Native American, you know, in a way that most Hollywood films are not. And so that's kind of my passion for truth, as Jonathan Lethem put it, my rage for truth. You know, well, I guess the last thing I'll say about that, Ford was asked in 1936 by an interviewer, "Do you like to make films about things that bother you?" And he said, "What the hell else does a man live for?" And I've always thought that because I write things about books about things that bother me or things that I feel haven't been covered adequately or things that are injustices have been done to people or subject matter has been neglected. And why else write a book? You don't just write too many books are just kind of rehashes of other books, but I'm trying to break new ground all the time. And this book, I guess, I mean, it'll surprise a lot of people. Danny said, well, geez, you know, I was surprised to learn a lot about these things about you. I try being extremely honest about myself, just, you know, like I was about, say, Capra, you know, or Ford. You find out,
I think you were. I think you were. And that's a great
thank
way
you.
to leave it. My guest has been Joseph McBride. He's author of I Love Movies, but Conversations with Danny Peary. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and especially stickingplacebooks.com, where you can get a discount. Stickingplacebooks.com and all the usual places. Joe, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Ira. It's always a great pleasure. So I'll see you again, I hope.
Absolutely. And join us every Thursday for a new schmear on Ira's Everything Bagel.